coming out to this, I'd say it's the 13th year we've gathered either here or at the Summers Mansion to remember Richard Summers and the men on his ship and the Americans who grew up with him at that time and their importance to our city and our country. Let me introduce myself. I'm Seth Grossman. I'm a lawyer in Summers Point and the executive director of a group called libertyandprosperity.org. And I invite you to learn more about that organization. I'm a little bit nervous because this is the first time in years that I and our organization have been in charge of this event, because for years Sally Hastings, sitting here, has put together the event, and my only job was to show up and say a few words and then eat at the buffet afterwards. So this year I really had to work, and I'm asking all of you that if I forgot to do something that Sally would always do or forgot to introduce somebody, please let me know, because this is on-the-job training. We also have with us some officials, and what I'm going to do, we have Mayor Jack Glasser of Summers Point to to welcome you to our town and to introduce some other officials who I believe are here. Jack? Oh, he's also a candidate for sheriff, but I'm not supposed to say that.
You're not supposed to say that. Always get a plug in somewhere. Welcome here to this ceremony that honors the memory of a great crew. Our favorite son, Richard Summers, who lost his life on that fateful day in September 4th, 1804. We've been meeting here for so many years, and I'm looking at Sally, and she has it right with us. But it's just, I want to thank you all for being here this evening or this afternoon, because we do have to keep the memory of Richard Summers and the great crew, the Intrepid, because there's still, to this day, after all the efforts starting in the mid-1800s to this day, but they're still there in Libya, and we can't bring them home. Whether it be our government, whether it be their government, or whatever. But rest assured, as long as I'll be the mayor, as long as I'm here in Summers Point, I will be fighting for Richard Summers and that crew to bring them home to rest in our country, not in a land that's so far away, in a land that is so against what we believe here in America. So with that, I'm going to make just a few more notions here. With us this afternoon is from Summers Point, the chairman of our Economic Development Advisory Commission, Greg Sikora, standing right here, and been a long supporter of Liberty Prosperity. Admiral Ron Denny, who's always been here and helping us out. I first met Ron down at when we were doing this at Summers Mansion many years ago. My good friend who's come from Galloway Township to be with us, Councilman Tony DePietro, who's here this afternoon. But again, I'm not one to stay up and talk all afternoon. I'm going to turn it over to Seth. But it's great to see you all out here, because we have to keep this memory. And one of the reasons that I've always been so grateful to the people that donated to put this, and the people that put this Richard Summers memorial here, is that we have something that we'll always remember them. And with the great mural that was made and the things that went into it about our town, it shows you what a little town in South Jersey can do and stand behind our favorite son who lost his life with his crew so many years ago when this country was in its infancy. And I know Seth's going to talk a lot more about it, but hopefully not too long. No, Seth's never too long. But Seth is, I always enjoy Seth's take on it. And I just saw Brendan Twelby, former commissioner from Margate, just came over. But again, thank you all for being here this afternoon, and just in memory of the great crew of the Intrepid and Master Commandant Richard Summers. So thank you.
Mayor Glasser, thank you very much. And again, we're just doing some preliminary introductions here. We'll start the program in just a few minutes. While we're waiting, I want to introduce, we have some members of the Richard Summers family here who traveled quite a bit to be here. Could you please come up and introduce yourself? We have Gail, okay, or at least one representative of the family if some are shy. And just introduce yourself. And yes, it's on.
My name is George Summers, Jr. I'm from Mullica Hill, New Jersey, originally from Mantua, New Jersey. And this is my daughter, Jane Summers, my son, George Summers III. And this is my niece, Gail. She's my sister's daughter. My sister passed away, both my sisters passed away. We were a family of 6. And we all live in South Jersey, in the Gloucester County area. And we just found out about this a couple weeks ago. My son got on the internet and he checked out the family tree. I knew most of it from a kid growing up, what your parents and grandparents would tell you. But I found out more about the family after my son got into the computer and dug up the history. So with that, I'm glad to be here. And, I'm going to enjoy the lunch too. Bye.
Well, thank you so much for coming. And when we see just the absolute brilliance of what Richard Summers did at the age of 20, at the age of 17, at the age of 23, at the age of 26, it's nice to know that we got some of his DNA still in South Jersey and that we're capable of those heroic deeds again. I also want to recognize here that there's a committee to bring back the body of Richard Summers, which is still in Tripoli, Libya, where it's been for the past 213 years. And I'm glad that Mayor Glasser spoke about that. I'm just wondering, is Mary Cannon here by any chance? Or I just want to, before we go any further, I want to thank her because she is the woman who put those magnificent paintings on the wall. And at a time when Americans are tearing down statues of people they claim they're ashamed of, it's so good that here in Summers Point, just in 2013, we built this statue and put it here. And 2 years later, we put up the mural. So we're taking care of our history. I also want to mention before we get started that we will be having a fundraising buffet afterwards. The tickets are $25. It'll be at Gregory's just 1 block away. And I hate to be so crass, but you heard Mr. Summers say he found out on the internet. We had to get radio spots. We had Facebook boosts. To get all of you here did not happen by accident. It cost us money to do that. And we'd like to continue this next year. So the money we raise this year pays for next year's event. And I also want to tell you that and by the way, you could buy the tickets at the door. I see, is there anything I forgot? Yeah, I will do that. And the other thing I want to mention is I'm hoping that in the future, this will not be Liberty and Prosperity presenting this event. I hope it won't be the Summers Point Historical Society presenting the event. And I hope it won't be the Summers Point Arts Council sponsoring this event, because we are volunteers. We don't have the time to do all this. I wish it were the Summers Point Public Schools preparing this event. I wish it were Mainland Regional High School doing this event. I wish it were Stockton University doing this event, because we are paying a fortune for those institutions to do this, and here we are. I'd like to begin by facing the flag of the United States and pledging allegiance to that flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. And as we always do at our Liberty and Prosperity meetings, we also do something. When they created the Pledge of Allegiance, there was a lot of controversy, and some people thought that besides pledging allegiance, we should go further and pledge allegiance to the principles of this country found in our Declaration of Independence. So I'll recite them, and by the way, they're on the card that we handed out. And if you don't have that card, I see we have Carla handing out the card, and we have some other folks handing it out. And it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, we institute governments which exercise their just powers with the consent of the governed." And those are our basic principles. And now I'd like to introduce Dave Brown to sing the national anthem.
Hang on, Dave. Wait a minute.
Please stand.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleam, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous night all the ramparts we watched while still gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Dave, another great Summers Point resident. Thank you very much, Dave. Now, at the time, we didn't get the Star-Spangled Banner as our national anthem until the 1930s. Until that time, there was another song that was widely sung at national gatherings. That song is called Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean. Now, that song first appeared in Philadelphia in the 1830s. And nobody knows who wrote it or why they wrote it. But if you listen to the lyrics of that song, you can't help but have the feeling it was somehow inspired by Richard Summers and Decatur and Charles Sumner and the other young Americans who fought that first battle against Islamic terror back in 1801, 1804. I'm going to call on Austin Satinsky. Travis Satinsky. Okay, Travis, here, come forward.
Oh, Columbia, the gem of the ocean.
Sorry, just learned the song. It's a little rusty. Sorry about this, folks.
Oh, Columbia, the gem of the ocean, the home of the brave and the free, the shrine of each patriot's devotion, a world of homage to thee. Thy mandates make heroes assemble, when liberty's form stands in view. Thy banner makes tyranny tremble, to born of the red, white, and blue. Born of the red, white, and blue. Born of the red, white, and blue. Thy banner makes tyranny tremble, when born of the red, white, and blue.
There we have, and it is such a pleasure to be almost hear a song heard by a young person learning it than by an older person knowing it perfectly, because it's our duty to turn this over to our younger generations. That song, by the way, as you can tell by the lyrics, is also a bit politically incorrect these days. Now, I want to mention a couple other things. As I mentioned before, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a professional historian. Neither is Sally Hastings. Neither is anyone else in our group. The story of Richard Somers is forgotten by most people, even here in Somers Point. The song, Columbia Gem of the Ocean, no longer taught in our schools, no longer a feature of our national life. For the past 70 years, and by the way, they're not forgotten, they are inconvenient and suppressed. Because for the past 70 years, since the beginning of the Cold War in the 1940s, Americans have been bombarded with relentless propaganda. That propaganda was first directed to opinion makers, professors, teachers, people in the media, people producing Hollywood movies, entertainers, and so on. And they have believed that propaganda and taught that to their students and the people they influence. And we all know the storyline that America is an evil country built on genocide and slavery. In fact, that's what they said in that march from Charlottesville to Washington last week to confront so-called white supremacy. They said, why are you marching? Because our nation was founded on genocide and slavery. The message, America is a bad country, not worth loving, not worth defending, not worth preserving, that the best thing we Americans could do for the world is to be like everybody else and disappear as a multicultural society. That's the message. And if you believe that propaganda, you don't want anyone to know about Richard Somers or his generation of Americans, because their story is very inconvenient. And to know how inconvenient it is, let's look at the wall and start to tell that story. Lesson number one, on that wall over there you see a map of what's called the Ottoman Empire. And you can only see a corner from this side. You can see the rest of it on the side facing Shore Road. But what was the Ottoman Empire? Well, you can't understand the Ottoman Empire unless you understand Islam. Islam started in the Arabian Peninsula in the year 600 or 700. Within 100 years, Islam, and by the way, before that, the entire Middle East was Christian and Jewish. All of North Africa was Christian. St. Augustine lived in what we now call the Barbary Coast. And within 50 years, Islam wiped out 2/3 of the Christian world. Wiped out the Christian world in all of North Africa and all of the Middle East. And all of Spain. And the Muslim world was about to go right to the gates of Paris, and only in the Battle of Tours did Charlemagne's father stop the Muslim advance. And then there was about 500 years of back and forth fighting between Christian Europe and Islamic North Africa. And the Islam was pushed out of Spain, but then you had another fierce tribe converted to Islam. They were the Ottoman Turks. And just when Christian Europe thought it was safe because it had beaten back the attacks in Spain, this new empire arose out of the east, and it conquered the Eastern Roman Empire, and it conquered what was called Constantinople, became Istanbul, and it conquered large areas of Europe. In fact, in 1643, it went right to the gates of Vienna. And only after 200 years of bitter fighting was there some sort of uneasy truce between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Now, under Islam, you may have heard the term caliph or caliphate or khalifa. You see, under the Islamic world, only one person is allowed to give orders to the Islamic world. That's the caliph or the caliph. And the Ottoman Turks, when they took the center of Christian Europe, which was then Constantinople, they became the leaders of the entire Muslim world. So when you see Ottoman Turk or Ottoman Empire, that was the Islamic Empire with the sultans of Istanbul as the caliph giving all the orders. So that happened in about the 1600s. For the next 200 years, there was a stalemate. So the Europeans couldn't conquer the Turks couldn't conquer the Europeans, but the Mediterranean was wide open. The Arabs controlled the Mediterranean, or the Turks controlled the Mediterranean, and that's where you see the Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and Tripoli. They were called the Barbary states. Now, a lot of times you'll hear the term the Barbary pirates. Now, what's a pirate? A pirate is an outlaw, right? A criminal, someone who robs in the high seas, the pirates of the Caribbean. So we called them the Barbary pirates, but they really were not pirates at all, because what they were doing was perfectly legal. You see, these kingdoms, Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and Tripoli, had declared war on the rest of Europe. They declared jihad. They were called mujahideen, not pirates. That's the term they had. But because they were fighting a legal war, if one of them was captured, they could not be executed as an outlaw. They were prisoners of war under international law at the time. So it was a crazy thing. And what was the leading industry of those four kingdoms? It was slavery. One of the inconvenient facts of history is during that 200 or 300 years I talked about, roughly 1.5 million Christians from Europe were taken as slaves and sold on the slave markets throughout the Arab world. At the same time, roughly 6 million black Africans from below the Sahara Desert were also taken, but there were no African American or there were no Arab African slave survivors in North Africa, because the male slaves were castrated and babies were killed at birth, because it was cheaper to get new slaves across the desert than to spend 15 or 16 years raising new ones. So those crimes are not known in our history. And that's why our young people make judgments about slavery, not knowing what was going on in that Islamic world. The other thing that's interesting is, as I mentioned before, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, controlled the Muslim world. And when the Barbary, I will call them I'll use their name, the Mujahideen, when they would attack and enslave Europeans. And by the way, those boats went up as far as Iceland and Ireland, where entire villages were captured. I want to thank Admiral Ron Denny. I meant to recognize him earlier for bringing that fact to me. We have some Navy officers. And why did they go that far north to capture slaves? Why didn't they just go to Spain or Italy? Because the people who bought the highest prices in the Arab slave markets were blonde, blue-haired women. And that's why the slave ships went up that far north to capture them. So all that stuff was going on. And finally, after 200 years of fighting, the Europeans couldn't defeat, one little detail, those northern African states. Every time the Europeans would go to the Sultan of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and say, will you please control these guys? The Sultan would say, oh, I can't control them. They're independent. You have to deal with them directly. Sort of sounds like us going to the Chinese to say, will you control those North Koreans? And the Chinese say, well, we can't control them. They're on their own. But somehow they always seem to work together. History is so similar. So what the Europeans ended up doing, they ended up working out a deal where they would pay tribute or bribes to those four kingdoms so they would no longer be attacked. And under Islamic law, you don't have a duty to kill or enslave non-Muslims if they pay you tribute and acknowledge your supremacy, which is basically what the Europeans did. Now fast forward. The Americans become independent from England. Before we became independent in 1783, our ships were protected by the bribes being paid by the British Empire. And when we were allies of France, we were protected by the bribes paid by France. But one thing about those Muslim terrorists, they read the newspapers. So when America declared its independence, they realized we were no longer protected by English and French bribes, and our ships were immediately attacked. When that happened, Thomas Jefferson, our ambassador to France, and John Adams, our ambassador to England, tried to negotiate with the leaders of those Islamic Barbary kingdoms and said, we Americans are a new nation. We've done you no harm. We've done you no offense. Why are you attacking our people? And they got this simple answer. We are Muslims, and according to our Quran, it is our duty to attack and enslave any unbeliever who refuses to pay tribute to us. And if any one of our sailors dies fighting you, they are guaranteed eternal paradise. That's what they were told. And when Thomas Jefferson heard this, he was astonished. He could not believe it. So he went out to London immediately and got an English translation of the Quran, which is why the Quran ended up in Thomas Jefferson's library, which you may have heard. So anyway, so that story continues. So Thomas Jefferson says, we cannot deal with these people. We must fight them. We must build a navy. But at the time in the 1780s, America didn't even have a constitution. We had no army, we had no navy. That's another little politically inconvenient fact, right? We were such a warlike nation, we Americans, right? Warlike people. As soon as our war with England was over and we had our independence, what was the first thing we did? We sent all the soldiers home and we turned our navy into scrap. We had no armed forces whatsoever for 15 years. So when the word came in from Thomas Jefferson, we've got to fight these people, Congress said, if the rest of the world is paying off these people, we're going to pay them off too. And for the next 15 years, Americans paid 10 to 20% of the federal budget as bribes to those 4 Barbary kingdoms. And then what happened? Instead of buying peace, what do you think the Barbary kingdoms did with the money we paid them as bribes? They bought faster ships, they bought more modern weapons, they recruited non-Muslim pirates to convert to Islam, saying, hey, you could be a pirate with us and it's legal. And what happened is they increased their demand for ransom, and Thomas Jefferson happened to be president at the time. And when that demand for more money came into Thomas Jefferson, who had been trying for the past 15 years to fight the pirates, what was his words? We don't know his exact words, but I think there was something like, make my day. And America finally had built a fleet. And by the way, I'm going through the story loosely, and I'm really just giving you snippets, and I hope that many of you will be interested and want to look this up online. Many good books have been written about it. But there came a point when Americans got tired of paying the bribes and said millions for defense, not 1 cent for tribute. We built a fleet, and at this time, where was Richard Somers? Richard Somers, like most Americans at the time, got an 8th grade education. He finished school at age 16. And in those 8 years, he learned more about literature, history, mathematics, science, navigation, astronomy than most 22-year-olds coming out of 12 years of public education and 4 years of college today. And, of course, they didn't go to school in the summer. You learned a trade in the summer. And the trade that Richard Somers learned was navigation and sailing ships. By age 17, after spending his boyhood taking small boats from here in Somers Point up to Mays Landing, shipping produce back and forth, by age 17, he was in command of cargo ships going from New York to Philadelphia. Oh, I forgot to tell you, there was no GPS back then, and they don't have any motors. He was very, very green energy. You know, when the wind stopped blowing, your boat stopped moving. But anyway, when Richard Somers at age 20 heard the need that America needed a navy to protect our people overseas, he was one of the first to join, and he went to Annapolis to become a midshipman. And that's another interesting thing, midshipman. You didn't learn how to be a Navy officer in a classroom. You were put on duty in the middle of a ship, and you were sent out to fight French pirates, and that's how Richard Somers learned the trade. At age 23, when 1801, when Thomas Jefferson finally sent the fleet to North Africa, Richard Somers was put in command of his own warship, the Nautilus. And I can't repeat, don't have time, I'm used up the time to tell you what they did, but all I can tell you, when the American fleet arrived with most of the ships being skippered by 23-year-olds like Richard Summers and his friend Decatur, Stephen Decatur, and Charles Sumner. They all came up together. The Europeans could not stop laughing. They called them a pack of schoolboys. They said, we've been fighting the fiercest pirates on the planet for hundreds of years, and you send a bunch of boys, what the heck are they going to do? Well, in 3 years, those Americans defeated these veteran pirate fleets or Barbary fleets, one after the other, until Pope Pius VII made a public announcement that he said the United States in a few years did more to protect Europe than the great powers of Christendom did in centuries. That's basically what happened, and we did amaze the world, and I think that is what inspired that song, Columbia, Gem of the Ocean. Except it has a tragic ending, of course. 3 of the 4 pirate kingdoms made peace with America, but the 4th one, Tripoli, held out. He was convinced that if he only held out a little bit longer and kept his fleet safe in the harbor, that Congress would get tired of paying for this war, especially since Thomas Jefferson had just spent a fortune to buy this new territory called Louisiana. And so the young officers who were out there had that same fear, so they wanted to do some desperate act that could bring the war to an end. And that's why on September 4th, 1804, Richard Summers loaded a small captured Arab ship, stuffed it with explosives, and he and 12 volunteers who knew they would probably not return alive. And those 12 volunteers are on the back of this statue. That they went out there and something went wrong. The ship somehow exploded prematurely. They all died. But the Arab world could not believe that they had never seen non-Muslims fight with that determination and that lack of fear of death, or so they thought. And the officers who served with Richard Summers were determined that no matter what Congress did, they were going to finish the war and do the job. And they did the next year by the shores of Tripoli, but that's the story of the Marines, and I don't want to go into that. But all I can tell you, it's a fascinating story. I just want to point out some of the high points, and maybe, Sal, if I get this wrong, in the mural, you see President Thomas Jefferson there. He was the one who sent the fleet to fight the Barbary pirates after 15 years of agitating that we should be fighting and not paying tribute and bribes. You see the depiction of the explosion of Richard Summers that fateful day in 1804. You see another incident in the middle. We don't have time to go into that, but that's the seizing of the Philadelphia. That the entire war against Tripoli and the Barbary pirates, they were not all successes. There were some setbacks. And one of the setbacks was one of our biggest ships ran aground and was captured. And so Stephen Decatur, Richard Summers' classmate, had a daring raid to sneak into the harbor and burn that ship so it would not fall into the hands of the enemy. The other 2 pictures show the pictures of these Muslim pirates. And again, when you use the term, what do you call them? They're not pirates. The official legal term they use is corsair or privateer. Someone who is lawfully attacking you because they would divide the money 3 ways. Whenever they would capture slaves, 1/3 would go to the government, 1/3 would go to the captain, 1/3 would be divided for the crew. But it was all legal because they had declared war on all non-Muslims who did not pay tribute. So again, they don't look like your Pirates of the Caribbean. And of course, you see the main picture, Master Commandant Richard Summers. I want to thank you for being here, and I am going to, something we haven't done before. We have about 5 minutes to go. If any of you have a question, because I know I jumped over the story and left out some pieces, please feel free to let me know. And I see we're calling this the self-taught revolution. There was a time when we would turn to our professors, our historians, But what we are finding out, as with so many experts today, many of those depend on grants, they depend on pensions, they depend on promotions, they depend on tenure, and very often, instead of reciting and researching the history as it happened, they do the research the way they want their people providing the funding to see it happen. And so what we have learned over the course of these past 14 years of doing this program, I see we have Mark Hutchinson, we have Steve Jones, so many ordinary citizens just taking the time to read through the records, Sally Hastings and so on, and that's why we have this complete history, which I submit we ought to publish it, and it will be equal to whatever any professor anywhere has done, because that's the American spirit. Just a side point, when America won its independence in 1776, the Europeans again laughed, because they were run by kings and princes and nobles who spent their entire lives learning how to run the government. And they said, how are these Americans going to know how to run the government? And of course, Americans understand that people are people, and if you can run a church, run an association, run a business, run a farm, all the techniques are the same, and you just apply your Yankee ingenuity to a problem and you fix it. And that's what we've done here, and I want to thank you. My last call, is there any piece of the story or any question that I left out?
What happened to the mosque in Tripoli overlooking the harbor?
Right now we have something called rules of engagement. And I find it ironic that the Barbary pirates back then called themselves Mujahideen, which means holy warrior fighting jihad, which is the identical name that the Taliban in Afghanistan uses to describe themselves fighting us now. Same name for the same reason, except under the rules of engagement, our military, if there's being shot at from a mosque, they're not allowed to return the fire. However, Richard Summers, there was a famous event called the Battle of the Gunboats in August of 1804, and what happened is they were the American fleet was sailing right by the harbor, and they were getting shot at by the people inside the city from a spotter inside the tower of a mosque. So I forget whether it was Stephen Decatur or Richard Summers. The first thing they did is they blew that thing up, and then they stopped catching fire. So, and you know what that reminds me. So people say, what resulted from that war in 1804, the lesson that we forgot. What you remember is that for 1,100 years, there was constant war between Christian Europe and the Islamic world. Constant taking of slaves, constant demand for ransom, constant violence. And then after these young Americans go there, what did we have for the next 190 years? We had peace between Europe and the Islamic world for the first time in 1,100 years. And what happened and when did it stop? As soon as we forgot the lessons of Richard Summers and those Americans, it all started up again, didn't it? And that's something we have to remember. And the final point I say, we were talking about the family of Richard Summers. I see John Risley, freeholder, is here, so I just want to recognize you. John, you always come every year. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, one question. Can you speak of the significance of the date September 11th, since that is tomorrow, and historically?
Yeah. It's amazing because there's going to be a ceremony, I think as we speak now, the official community of Atlantic County, and by the way, I'm probably more newspaper reporters there, and the official news is, I think it's called a unity observance of September 11th. As you know, America was attacked on September 11th, 2001, and 3,000 Americans were killed. Why did they attack us on September 11th? Why didn't they pick August 28th? Why didn't they pick May 17th? Anybody know? Anybody remember? Well, you see, remember I said how after the Muslim Turks seized Constantinople, which was the head of the church at that time, And then the last surviving head of the church was the Roman Catholic Church in Rome. The next step was to conquer Rome as well. But to get to Rome, they had to go through Vienna in Austria and then come down the Alps. And you could see it up there. So what happened is you had this army of about 300,000 Muslim Turks surrounded the city of Vienna. And they put people, they called them sappers. They dug tunnels, and on September 10th, they put high explosives under the walls of Vienna. And they blew up the last walls defending the city on September 10th. And it looked like they would capture Vienna, and had they captured Vienna, they would have probably wiped out what was left of Christian Europe. Now to answer your question, what happened on September 11th? What happened on September 11th is unknown to the Turks. The Polish army, under the command of Jan Sobieski, gathered a force of 50,000 men in the mountains behind Vienna, and on September 11th, he descended from the rear of the Turkish army and basically wiped it out. And what we have from that battle is not only was Vienna saved, but the bakers of Vienna, who were the ones who were up at night and heard the Turks tunneling underneath and gave some warning, they baked 2 pastries in honor of that victory. One was the croissant, the shape of the Turkish flag, which they ate with relish, and the other one was a type of bread that was baked in the shape of a stirrup to remind them of the cavalry stirrups of Sobieski's army, and we know that pastry is the bagel today. So that's what happened on September 11th, and of course they had the Turks, when they fled, they left piles and piles of coffee beans there. So that's where many of our European traditions started, from September 11th. So it really wasn't a day of unity. It was a day. So again, why did the Muslims pick that day to attack us? Because in their mind, they had almost wiped out Europe on September 10th. On September 11th, 1683, they were pushed back. And when they picked September 11th, they're saying, we're back at it, we're coming back. That's why they picked September 11th. And if we refuse to know who our enemy is and why they're doing this, then we're not going to be able to defend ourselves. Okay?
So doing the state flag story?
Okay. All right, so I have to do this. I had someone saying, I forgot. Liberty and prosperity, that's the flag of New Jersey. 3 symbols on that flag to know about. The red cap of liberty on the flag, that was what Roman slaves wore after they had gained their freedom. So to wear that red cap said, I used to be a slave, but now I am free. You have the wooden stick. That was the only weapon that townspeople and farmers in Europe could afford. If they would fight against the nobility, a knight with a sword, shield, and armor, and a horse, he'd be cut to pieces. But if the whole village would turn out with hundreds and thousands of ordinary peasants holding those wooden sticks, they could knock the knights off their high horses and preserve their liberty. And of course, where you had liberty, you also had prosperity. And prosperity symbolized by the horn of plenty, the cornucopia. Those are the symbols of the New Jersey flag, and that's the meaning of the motto, Liberty in New Jersey. That flag was adopted in 1776. So thank you very much. I hope that many of you will come, run back over to Gregory so we could unwind and just talk, share stories, and most important, have the money to do this again next year. Thank you.